He's absolutely brazen. He will sit down next to a figure from the royal family and put his arm around her at a party with all the aristocrats there and start moving in on her. There are stories that you have to know that the Tsar and Tsarina knew he was this way, because at these family gatherings I mentioned earlier, where they're all sitting there and it's just him and the family, he'll sit next to the princesses, who are all adolescent girls during this time period, and they will jump up like they've been, prodded with a hot needle, because he's goosing them and feeling them in front of the Tsar and Tsarina. And yet at the same time, some of this stuff is passed off as just part of his rustic peasant charm. Isn't it cute that he doesn't know how inappropriate that is? Like I said, some of these people in Russia's aristocracy hated him, but those who didn't kind of had a reaction like he was some sort of exotic thing that the zoo brought in, and you have to make allowances for what he doesn't understand. He might not know you can't just walk up and touch some noble woman's breast at dinner, and how funny and interesting it is. Isn't he outrageous? That kind of an attitude. But he was fun, and historian Joseph Furman, who's written 2 books on Rasputin, points that out. Quote, "Rasputin was fun. It was a pleasure to be in his company. He gave people nicknames, and they were often cutting and quite appropriate. He might dub a woman hot stuff, boss lady, sexy girl, or good looking, while a man would be called fancy pants, big breeches, long hair, or fella. People accepted this as a charming characteristic, the humor of a peasant who meant no disrespect," end quote. So the people that didn't hate Rasputin would often, overlook his outrageousness and consider that part of, his charm, his rustic peasant charm. Nonetheless, sometimes it was a little too much even for the Tsar. There are famous incidents, and they all end up in the local media. Believe it or not, Russia had a tabloid media during this time period, and Rasputin was one of their staple, figures. I mean, back in my day, every one of them had to have an Elizabeth Taylor story or a Michael Jackson story or something like that. Kim Kardashian probably today. Back then in Russia, if you didn't have a Rasputin story, every so often, you were worried about circulation dropping. And just when you think there'd be no new news, he gets roaring drunk in a highfalutin restaurant in the capital city, starts yelling about how he knows the Tsar, and then pulls his pants down and whips his genitals out to the restaurant. Word like that gets around, and the tabloids eat it up. At one point, the Tsar had to tell the tabloids that they couldn't mention his name anymore. So they just started referring to him as the guy who lives on so-and-so street, whatever street he lived on, and everyone in the public just knew who they meant. There were cartoons that made the rounds showing Rasputin with his hand on the naked breast of the Tsarina, implying what a lot of people wondered about this relationship, although it's almost certainly not true. If Rasputin's going around town sleeping with everything that moves, from peasants to royal women as well, what's he doing with the Tsarina? There are even whisperings and one public charge made that the heir to the throne, the Tsar's son, is really Rasputin's son. Almost certainly not true, but the more gossip circulated with that kind of talk, the more it undermined, people's trust in the Tsar and Tsarina. Remember, the Tsarina's already German at a time when the Russian people are hounding Russian generals who just have German last names. What happens if you are German and the Tsar's not around, and this strange Russian peasant who seems like a Svengali is? There were protests in 1915 where the people were saying, down with Rasputin, down with Alexandra. He's not an unknown quantity. Everyone realizes he's almost a public figure. They debate him in the legislature, and the powers that be want him gone. There's a story during this time period about one of the ways they tried to get him out. It's a famous story. One day, Rasputin hears a knock at his door. He goes to the door, and there's a man standing there with a package. He gives Rasputin the package, and Rasputin opens the package, and it's full of photos. And Rasputin looks at the photos, and they are photos of him, unconscious, insensible due to drink, and there are naked women all around him. Night photos. The man at the door who gave him the package says, either you leave town and go back to where you came from and stop talking and influencing the Tsar, or we're going to give these pictures to him. It was an extortion attempt. And on one of the nights, apparently, that Rasputin had passed out from drink, his enemies had hired prostitutes and positioned them around him naked and started taking photos to blackmail him. In typical unexpected fashion, Rasputin took the photos straight to the Tsar and sort of, threw himself on the mercy of the court. Now, a lot of the time, Rasputin's able to skate away with no real repercussions. Sometimes he's not. As we said, occasional rifts would develop between the Tsar and Rasputin. One of them, for example, that went on in 1912 is a perfect example of how hard it was for the Tsar to stay away from Rasputin. In 1912, they have one of these disagreements. The Tsar sends Rasputin back to Siberia. The royal family goes on vacation in September 1912 to their country palace. They're playing around, and the young heir to the throne, Alexei, jumps in a boat. He's about 7 or 8 years old. Not unusual. Not unusual for a 7 or 8-year-old to land wrong and hurt themselves. But most of these 7 or 8-year-olds are, of course, not hemophiliacs. So it instantly becomes a problem. There's a giant hematoma in his lower abdomen. They take him back to the palace, and they have a terrible scare. He gets very ill, very bad. It takes about a month for him to start to recover. And as he's just starting to turn the corner, and I've never understood this, his mother, the Tsarina, thinks it'd be great to take him on a little carriage ride. And it's a bumpy road, and they hit some bump, and he cries out in pain, and something's happened inside him. They take him back to the palace, and now they have one of the most horrific periods of their life starting, because this kid starts to die. And it takes a while, and it's very painful, and the parents are watching. And the kid's fever skyrockets. The pain becomes so terrible, he's delirious and slipping in and out of consciousness. I read somewhere that opium is used in the past, sometimes for people in the heir to the throne's condition, but they didn't use it for him. And the screams are so terrible that we're told the palace staff has to stuff cotton in their ears to walk around to deal with it. The parents, like I said, loving, real hands-on parents, take their turn at his bedside. And he's begging for help. He's saying, "Lord, have mercy on me." That's one of the things recorded over and over and over again. And "Mama, help me, the pain." And we're told when the parents' shift at the bedside was over, they would walk out of the room and just burst into tears. The Tsar said that the Tsarina handled the ordeal better than he did. At a certain point, the doctors run out of things to do. They tell the parents there's nothing more they can do. It becomes apparent to the parents and to the patient that he's dying, and he starts talking about those things that destroy parents. I mean, you never want to hear your little kid saying. He's saying, "When I die, will the pain be gone?" to his mother. He asks that after he dies, they build this little shrine in the woods for him out of stones. And then the reality of the situation sets in, and they start putting together a public statement to tell the Russian people that the heir to the throne has died. The last rites are performed, and while at a meeting, the Tsar gets a hand-scrawled note from his wife saying, "Come quickly, I think it's time. The boy's about to die." At the last minute, the Tsarina pens a note to Rasputin off in Siberia, essentially saying, "Help." And she gets a cable the next morning. It's a famous cable, and it lets a little air out of the tires, but it's not as good, according to historian Joseph Furman, as we always thought it was. The cable was always thought to say, "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." End quote. A Russian historian, Alexander Spiridovich, apparently says there were two notes, but the one that was misquoted really said, quote, "Fear nothing. The illness is not as dangerous as they're saying. See that the doctors do not bother him." End quote. By that afternoon, the boy is out of pain and is able to sleep, and the fever starts dropping. The doctors are stunned, and it should be pointed out they hate Rasputin. But they were forced. I mean, there's several of them quoted in Furman's latest book. He's written 2 books on Rasputin, and they don't know what to even make of it. And it wasn't just this time. They would be trying to stop the boy from bleeding in past incidents, and Rasputin would come up and they would watch him stop it. And historians have been trying to find explanations for this ever since. I mean, I've heard everything from hypnosis to the power of suggestion